how to downgrade your Puffco Peak Pro's firmware from Firmware X to Firmware W, or you got stuck in between the firmware updates and your Puffco is bricked, but it's not really bricked. We're gonna get into it. Let's go. Now, first question, why would you want to have the Puffco Peak Pro firmware downgraded? You want to be able to use Puffco Voice to utilize voice commands with Siri and Amazon Alexa with your Amazon Alexa devices or your Siri devices, whether it's your Apple HomePod or Watch or your iPhone or iMac. Let's go. First, head over to GitHub and go to Frost's Puffco firmware tool, which will be in the description of the video. Make sure to download the Puffco firmware tool v1.2.exe. Next, go to your downloads folder and move your .exe Puffco firmware tool to your desktop. Next, start it as administrator. Click more info, run anyway. Before starting, you'll want to go into your phone's Bluetooth and disconnect your Puffco Peak Pro, forget the device, as well as turn off your Bluetooth. Last, force close the Puffco Connect app and Path Browser. Next, you need to go into your PC's Bluetooth settings and connect your Puffco Peak Pro base to your PC. If you don't connect your Puffco Peak Pro with the Bluetooth to your PC, it will not work and you'll get some error codes, but it won't affect anything. It just won't be able to connect and come up with some error. If you're still having issues connecting your Puffco to your firmware tool, make sure you remove your Bluetooth device and reconnect it through the Bluetooth settings of the PC. In your Bluetooth connections, you'll most likely be looking for your Puffco Peak Pro base's name, but if not, you'll be looking for the MAC address. If you're having issues finding the MAC address, you could check out how to find the MAC address using the Puffco Voice Find Puffco feature that will allow you to find your Puffco's MAC address. Just make sure your Puffco Peak Pro base is in Bluetooth pairing mode. Either write it down or remember your MAC address and just make sure if you need it that you have it so you know what to connect to. Now that we have our Peak Pro connected to our PC via Bluetooth, we are ready to search for our Puffco. Put your base back into Bluetooth pairing mode and search for your Puffco. We're going to be downgrading the firmware from Firmware X to W. As you can see, we could not find the Puffco. This is probably because we have too many Bluetooth connections in our PC's Bluetooth settings. Go through and delete those if you have any issues. Either way, you got to go through and do this process again. If you have any issues, there's really nothing that could happen that's bad to the base, and even then, if it goes into DFU mode, which is seen as bricking to most people, it is fixable, and we'll be going through that later in the video. After a couple of tries, you'll get it to where it works. Make sure your Bluetooth pairing is on for your base. Pair from there, you'll see the lights pop off and it will go into DFU mode. Give it a little bit of time. It will start uploading the firmware W. Takes a little bit of time. It seems to be faster on my PC than the developer's PC, so it might take you a little bit longer than what it did in this video. When the firmware is done uploading, it'll take about 20 seconds to finalize and then another 20 to 30 seconds for your device to pop back on with the white light, which will then give you the ability to interact with your base and pick temperature profiles. If you're generally having issues with the official Puffco app and updating your Puffco Peak Pro firmware to Firmware X from W, you could also utilize the firmware tool for that. First, make sure you've gone through the beginning of the video and how we set up the Bluetooth connections with the PC. Then put your Peak Pro base into Bluetooth pairing mode. Next, search for your Puffco Peak Pro base using the firmware tool. Next, make sure the firmware tool has the right device. Then pick Firmware X. Press enter and it'll install. If your Puffco doesn't connect to the tool, just rerun the search or restart the tool in total. In general, I had an issue and we did not have it connect properly, but we will rerun it and you'll see that it'll work just fine. And once I closed and reopened the firmware tool, it worked just fine. Make sure your Puffco Peak Pro is in Bluetooth pairing mode. Follow the instructions, pick the right Puffco, select the right firmware, start the update, and you'll see that your Puffco's lights will turn off and it'll go into DFU mode. Now that it's in DFU mode, give it some time to upload the firmware, finalize the firmware, and give it that time to reboot. As I said, my uploading time was much faster than the developer, so it might take you a little bit longer to upload your firmware to your Puffco Peak Pro base. Once your firmware is done uploading, you'll have to wait about 10 to 20 seconds for your Puffco Peak Pro base to reboot. The white light will come on and then you'll have access to all your temperature profiles. And for the last firmware issue that everyone would want to solve is the bricked Puffco DFU Puffco firmware fix. This happens due to exiting the official Puffco app during an update or some other reason that I don't even know, maybe an error. No matter the cause, as long as it wasn't water damage, can be fixed. To unbrick your bricked Puffco or DFU searching Puffco, you'll need to go into your Bluetooth settings and remove your Puffco Peak Pro device name from your PC Bluetooth connection settings. Once you've removed your Puffco Peak Pro's name from your Bluetooth devices on your PC, you'll want to go back into your PC's Bluetooth and search for your Puffco. It'll come up as a MAC address. It won't come up as your name for your Puffco, but once a firmware is re-uploaded, your name will get reset to whatever it was that you named it as. After you find the Bluetooth MAC address and connect it to your PC, you're ready to start the unbricking process. Go back to your Puffco firmware tool and search for DFU Puffcos. It'll take some time, but you have absolutely nothing that you have to do other than wait Make sure that you just keep waiting. It will then say that it has found a Puffco and that it is installing firmware W onto it. Give it as much time as it needs. It might take you a bit longer than my PC, but in general it will work. Once firmware W is installed, your Puffco Peak Pro base will be kicked out of DFU mode and you'll be able to access all your temperature profiles. If you'd like to update to firmware X after unbricking your Puffco that has been updated to firmware W, you'll want to reconnect your Puffco Peak Pro's base to your PC's Bluetooth. If you don't remove the device, you won't be able to reconnect to the Puffco firmware tool. First, remove your Puffco Peak Pro base MAC address, then go back into Add Device. You'll be waiting for your named Puffco base, which for me is Baby Girl, and then following all of our previous steps, able to update to firmware X. If you're still having difficulties with getting your Puffco Peak Pro base to connect to the Puffco firmware tool, go into your PC's Bluetooth connections and remove the Puffco Peak Pro base and reconnect it through the Bluetooth settings. If after the first time you still have some connectivity issues, go back into your PC's Bluetooth settings and remove your Puffco Peak Pro base once again, reconnect it, and keep doing that until it works. As you can see, I too am running into some issues, but after a couple of re-clicks and some researches and some repairings on the Puffco Peak Pro base, it wasn't a problem, and we just went forward and installed it. Either way, you already saw everything, and your Puffco's not bricked anymore. If you're having trouble with your Puffco Peak Pro base and you don't know whether or not you could actually utilize this firmware tool, you'll have to actually put it on a Pro Dock, because the Pro Dock is the best thing to notice whether or not it is an active Pro base. If you don't have that blue light, you might have some water damage that's affecting your battery and all those other parts that makes it so it doesn't actually read as connected to the Pro Dock. Beyond all that, thanks for checking out this video. Frosty, big shout out to you for coming through with a wonderful Puffco firmware tool. Beyond that, don't forget to subscribe, smash that like button, get ready for more content. We're going to be stitching up our Peak Pro content and then moving on through our OG content, remaking all of our OG content for atomizer rebuilds and then all that other stuff. Beyond that, stay elevated and peace out.